Welcome to the Clause Match webinar on policy management, governance, and leveraging your culture. We did upload the deck, so if you want to download it, sometimes you can get it, sometimes you can't. Otherwise, we're going to be sending it out or making a recording available with the slides. Clause Match is, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Welcome, everybody. Hopefully, everybody's doing well and can see us. We're trying to look as healthy as we can here. And let me get the slideshow going in terms of this, and we'll be good. Okay. So welcome again. We have three panelists and let's just say two other very distinguished people besides myself. We have Willem Wellinghoff. He's a Global Chief Compliance Officer and Risk Officer. He has a British accent, as you'll hear, and so he's obviously very well informed. And we have Jeff Weiss, who I've known for years and worked on compliance matters, who's the EVP of Sales for the US for Clause Match. Welcome to the two of you. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us.
Great to have us.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hey, Mike, thank you. You need to put it into presentation mode, sorry. We're not seeing the slides.
Oh, wait a minute. I apologize. Okay, can you see them now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry about that. Well, wait, let me go back though, because they have to see the good-looking people that we have here, the pictures. Sorry about that. There they are. There's myself, Willem, and Jeff. Okay, I have to complete the job here. And a few housekeeping items. And I wanted to introduce Amanda Brief from Clause Match. And Amanda, did you want to go over some of this real quickly?
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Michael. So just a reminder, all of you are muted except for the panelists. So if you have any issues that you want to address, please put it in the chat box. Additionally, if you have any questions for the panelists, please put it in the Q&A box and we'll address the questions at the end of the webinar. And then lastly, for those who are interested in getting a copy of the recording as well as the slide deck, we'll be sending that out on Friday, so please look out for that email. And with that, I'll hand it back to Mike.
Well, thank you, Amanda. Appreciate it. Just a note here, thank you to Clause Match for sponsoring this. Clause Match, I've seen the product. It's actually really quite innovative in terms of policy management, but it's a regulatory change solution as well, and change management for regulations, which I think is a big deal these days, because I always get lots of calls about people asking me, how do we stay on top of all the global regulation framework that we have? So that's my little promo and thanks to Clause Match for sponsoring this. And we're so glad that Jeff, who you probably have known for many years, has joined them. So let's get to the substance real quick on compliance policy management, and we're going to start with sort of what are the DOJ and regulatory expectations. Before we get into that, we're going to do a couple polls and just find out sort of where people are. As a manager of legal and compliance, my level of experience is, and we have four choices. I put myself in the newbie. I put Jeff and Willem in the veteran, and then we have well-versed and seasoned professional, which means you have to have sort of seasoned presentation. But very interesting. Thanks for everybody jumping on that. But just so we have a context for sort of our audience, it actually helps us, I think, in sort of addressing certain issues. So let's close the poll and share the results. So we have some newbies, we have some well-versed, it's kind of split, and seasoned professionals, and we have an 8% of veterans. That's terrific. So let's get into this. In the best way to start, obviously, there are three very good sources with regard to the Justice Department and the SEC's actually regulatory expectations around policy management. The first, which was the revised version, which was issued last year, was the evaluation
Hey,
of.
Michael.
Yeah.
Hey, sorry to interrupt, but we're just seeing the poll, so you have to jump back to the presentation.
Oh, thank you for that. You see it now? Oh, I see what you're doing. I got you. Okay. Thank you, Jeff. Okay. So, Criminal Division evaluation of corporate compliance programs, Antitrust Division evaluation of corporate compliance programs, which was in July 2019. And then we had the update, the second edition of the DOJ and SEC Resource Guide to the FCPA. So this is a great source to start from. In my mind, it builds a little bit more than sort of the sentencing guidelines or some of the international type of statements. These are good things to, I think, start with. I want to highlight in terms of one of the consistent statements by the Justice Department on policies and procedures, and that is that well-designed compliance programs include policies and procedures that give, quote, content and effect to ethical norms and aim to reduce risks identified through the risk assessment process. And we're really glad to have Willem here. And Willem, as a practitioner and as a real chief compliance officer on the ground, how do you approach this issue, and what do you take from those words there?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and the way I would look at it is it's very different from firm to firm. You've got companies that are 10 people strong, where actually everyone is pretty much in tune with one another. But then you've got large global organizations of thousands of people. So proportionately, it can be quite complicated to put in place an effective, well-designed compliance program. But the way it really kind of starts is culture. The way I look at it is it emanates from the culture of the company. If you focus on the right things to do, on the right focuses, ensuring that the DNA of the people that you have, to your programs, to your processes, focus on the right thing, right? It focuses, of course, on legislation, but it focuses predominantly on what is ethical for your target audience. And that's a core focus on building a well-designed compliance program. And from that, you can then essentially mature through a risk management or a risk assessment process that happens on an ongoing basis to pick up the weaknesses, the challenges, the focus points, and it evolves from that period onwards.
Great. Okay. So let's go. Oops, sorry about that. Let's go to the two fundamental requirements that are in the guidance is a code of conduct. And most companies, obviously, if you're listed on the stock exchange or anything like that in the United States, you have to have a code of conduct that demonstrates compliance with the laws, but also with more than that, your culture, and policies and procedures that incorporate the culture of compliance into your day-to-day operations. And I think the other important aspect to this is, and Willem sort of referred to it, is what is your culture and what is your culture of compliance? Because that now permeates everything that we see here in terms of policies and procedures, and also what the government expects. They want to see proof of a culture of compliance, and you have to demonstrate that. And I think what Willem was saying is that's where you start, and then you build in the risk management sort of flow after that. Any comments, Jeff, from you in terms of what you've seen working with clients and sort of what they're looking at, and as they're trying to get their arms around policy management and regulatory changes?
Yeah, I think, even taking a step back from the code of conduct, a well-designed program starts with a policy on policies, right? Code of conduct is a policy, but you really need to have a standardization of how you're going to go through the process of creating and managing policies and the life cycle of the policy within your organization. So having a good policy on policies and, and a governance around that as a starting point, and then build a code of conduct to be the overarching kind of expectations of the organization. And then from there, everything should tie back into those two things.
And what I think we've talked about, Jeff and I have talked about, and Willem, we were talking about this actually yesterday, was that a lot of people take their code of conduct and then reference policies that they have, not in detail, but at least reference the policies into the code of conduct. So as you have your sort of policy population, there's references back into that. But Willem, any comments on codes of conduct and sort of what you've seen and what you think works in this situation?
Yeah, I have seen some great code of conduct, but I've equally seen huge documents that actually no one would ever read, because the essence of what the code of conduct is becomes such an unwieldy document that people lose the essence of what it's designed to do. And you've mentioned it, is because sometimes they cross-reference policies within it, or sometimes include massive policy statements and procedures within a code of conduct, which by virtue of what it's designed to do becomes ineffective. So again, let's take it back to what a code of conduct is. It's about your culture. It's about how you would want the organization and your employees to behave in dealing with your target customers, but also how you interact with a regulatory and compliance environment. That's really what it's designed to do. It's not complicated. And you can actually design it by having standard principles that you build upon for your underlying policies and your processes. But and Jeff mentioned it very briefly, but governance is a crucial point. You can have a policy on a policy, but in essence, what it's really designed, coming back to it, it's having the appropriate governance. What are your governance arrangements? Document them. It doesn't have to be complicated. Some organizations are a little bit more complicated by design, but it doesn't have to be. And then from there is your roles and responsibilities. What are the people's roles? What are the responsibilities that they have and their accountabilities in behaving with the organization and its customers? And by design, that can be quite clear, should be concise, and it should be a core document in which you manage your employees' performance on.
And one of the, just to follow up on a couple of points Willem made, most companies are doing code of conduct training every year, which I think is a good thing to do. Short and sweet is great. Foreign languages and accessibility is critical now on your intranet and the internet. I think it's an important enough policy statement that it should be on your public internet. I know I'm cutting my own reputation down here, but please, no lawyers, no legalese. Get rid of the lawyers and let the real people do it. The 5 elements outlined by DOJ, and we're going to just dig into these a little bit. Design, is it a well-designed? Comprehensiveness, accessibility, operational integration, and the role of gatekeepers. I want to make just a few points out of here. I'm not going to read this, but these are questions from the guidance, and they're what I would call them pointed questions. The first is, what's your procedure for updating policies and procedures? In other words, what's your framework for doing that? We need to establish some kind of framework for that to make sure that there's a regular cadence to update and also when we talk about a little bit more about clause match and also the importance of regulatory landscape. Regulations change every day around the world, and that may impact your business, and it's more critical under comprehensiveness to make sure that you address that problem. And then finally, one other point, you have to make sure your business is part of the process. That's a big deal to DOJ. And it's a big deal to DOJ because they know that compliance is never going to happen unless business buys in, because we can't have 3,000 compliance officers watching everybody every day. We have to rely on our business partners. And so if they feel they have a stake in the process, I think that's gonna help. So we got to make sure that those three sort of elements are addressed, I think, with regard to design and comprehensiveness. Jeff, any comments on that, at least from your perspective with
Yeah, I
clients?
think what you said is including the business in the business owners in the policy development process, but also having a well-defined approval process and workflow for the approval of policies, right? So you need to really drive consistency in the approval process and not just have somebody say, hey, I don't agree with wearing a mask to work, so I'm going to write my own policy on that. You need to have a clearly defined process for designing and developing and approving policies, depending on what the policy is and how integral it is to the organization, and then have it documented and have a single source for your employees to go to find those policies. And I was working with a financial institution, and I think they have 20 different policy portals to find policies in across their organization, and employees are just totally confused where to go to find a policy. So I think all those things are very critical in the design and comprehensiveness of the program and the development of the policies.
And centralizing it, because I always remember the story years ago. I went to a company and they told me, oh wait, we don't even know where are all of our policies. We don't have a central location for them. Various operations have their own policies, and that is just a recipe for disaster. So let me just mention these in accessibility, the integration and gatekeepers, and turn it over to you, Willem. Just how do these principles apply in your real work, and how do you make sure you hit these three topics?
So let me talk about what Jeff mentioned just now, that a lot of companies have many different portals where policies are stored, or even sometimes not even portals. They're stored on a cloud drive somewhere in not accessible at all, and it becomes very unwieldy to manage, because you don't know always which policy is the most applicable policy, which one is the most reviewed, or so accessibility and transparency is crucial, not only to the communication internally within your organization, but third-party awareness, because it all hangs off of each other. Whatever you say to your customers or your social responsibility in the community, that immediately emanates what you do from a cultural perspective, as well as your overall company policies and procedures. Foreign language, again, it comes back to accessibility. You need to make policies accessible to everyone in a language that everyone understands. Legalese, I don't agree with it. For me, every document should be the acid test that if you give it to an 11-year-old and they understand it, you've got a good document. Not always easy when you're talking about regulation, but it's possible in some ways. And then not only tracking access to policies and procedures, it's also tracking when it was reviewed, and whether any change has occurred from an external perspective that requires a change to policies and procedures, because that is often overseen. And then from a responsibility, for me, yes, it comes back to governance. The roles and responsibilities in maintaining policies and procedures has to be documented some shape or form so that people are accountable for the controls that they issue within the organization. And that then comes back to gatekeepers, right? And you know, gatekeepers doesn't necessarily mean individuals. That can all be dealt with, digitized. Like an approval process can actually be really fantastic and well digitized, especially with the solutions. And you know, we talk about solutions like clause match that has that. You know, you have a very digitized way of approving policies, and also with more solutions like a clause match coming onto that. And I've worked with clause match as a mentor through the government, a government RegTech accelerator. The way that is managed is quite, you know, amazing, and we'll come on to that later. And then it's about knowledge, you know. So whilst we've got the policies and the operational integration, it's about how do you transpose the knowledge of what you've just built in a policy and procedure down to everyone in a comprehensive manner. And again, that's a crucial aspect. So all these points are actually spot on. I suppose it's always going to be proportionately how and what, you know, why do you need it is the most critical question. What do you need to do? Well, this is it, but the how is where a lot of people struggle.
Yeah, and Willem, wouldn't you say that what regulators are looking for is the ability to document all of this as well, so that you actually can demonstrate you're doing all of these things?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm not talking just from the US DOJ. I'm talking, you know, everything. You know, all the regulators on a global perspective, they expect you to know and document, you know, your controls, but also importantly, decisions made on those controls. So if there are material decisions you need to make about a certain process or a change, you need to be able to demonstrate how that decision was made. And if that was tied back to a policy procedure or a regulatory change or whatever, it all needs to be centralized and, you know, available for evidence.
So that's sort of the framework, the DOJ framework. But I think Willem's point is really well taken. For example, if you look at the regulatory landscape in the UK, just as an example, you have agencies there, particularly in the financial industry, that are extremely rigorous in their oversight process. And I think that it also goes to, it's a great way also to sort of manage your program when you're documenting and you can sort of see data and then you can see how the process is working, who's accessing. I will tell you, one of the really difficult parts that came up from DOJ in the last round of guidance was they expect companies to keep track of people, like how many times people look at your policies online and you know, what portions, what are they reading? And the reason they want you to do it, it's kind of like, you know, tracking your user base to see what are they interested in, where are they asking questions, and that ability to track that interaction is really true. We started sort of the presentation with talking about culture, and now we're talking about practically how do we implement this and how do we do this? And we have obviously Jeff and Willem who work with clients, and Willem is actually a client, but also in a sense, Willem also worked with the Tech Nation, the government-sponsored sort of testing process for compliance solutions. So that's what I think you were referring to there, Willem.
That's right.
And he's very modest, but it actually is a very big deal in the UK in terms of testing products that then are testing approaches and technologies that then can be, you know, sort of blessed by the regulators and built with the regulators. So, but let's start again at first with the idea of culture. And how do we get the culture? How do we demonstrate? How do we first communicate to you know, our company internally the importance of compliance and our ethical culture? Well, look, words are cheap, and one general concept is you demonstrate it through your conduct. And here again is, so what is your conduct surrounding your code of conduct, your policies and procedures? What are the ways in which you make it available, that you train people on these policies and procedures? And how do you manage it so that, for example, we do have one comprehensive set of policies and procedures that are, accessible to anybody within the company as well as your third parties? And how do we do that? So these are the principles we've talked to already, but I want to just emphasize the last bullet point here about the continuous improvement loop. And Willem referred to that in terms of tying this, and we're going to talk about this, to updating your policies and procedures consistent with your risks. Your risk profile is constantly changing, particularly if you acquire a company or you enter new markets or you change your business operations in some ways. Your risk profile changes, and the regulatory expectation is so does your program, because it has to sort of go up and down to the sideways, whatever, as your risk profile changes. And your policy management has to be proof of that. Your policy management process has to demonstrate that and be consistent with the regulatory changes that are occurring around the world that may impact your business in various countries as you're operating. And I sort of am setting Willem and Jeff up for this issue because this, to me, is one of the most challenging issues that I find that companies face these days. And Willem and Jeff, why don't we start with you, Jeff, in terms of the legal and regulatory maze, and then Willem can sort of bring us back to center, hopefully.
Yeah, I think going back to something you just said, Michael, about the global complexity of managing policies, right? It's not just language, but it's really localization and making business decisions on how you're going to implement things like data privacy, right? Different geographies in the world have different views on data privacy, and companies have to make a decision on how they're going to implement that. Are they going to do it from the least common denominator, or are they going to take advantage of whatever they can in each region that they're doing business? So based on that, they have a global policy that has localization applied based on how they're going to implement that in the different regions they're doing business. So and then as those things change, they're going to have to modify those, but it needs to be tied back to a centralized policy. And as those laws and regulations change, they then can go roll those out accordingly. But they need to understand the complexity of that maze of linkages between the master policy and all those localized versions of the policy as well.
And you know what, Jeff, one of the prime areas that I see this challenge is in, if you're in the pharmaceutical or medical device industry. For example, the EU obviously has a whole different regime than the FDA in the United States, but so do a lot of other countries. And so keeping your finger on the pulse of the regulatory changes that occur. And you can imagine, obviously with the COVID and the pressure that went on with regard to vaccines and the regulations that were surrounding that, what a challenge that must have been as, let's say, the vaccine was being made available or there was demand for it in other countries. So to me, that sort of highlighted, and we had a lot of questions surrounding that because this legal and regulatory maze was constantly shifting during, and obviously it was a global pandemic, but it highlighted to me what is a big risk area, particularly for drug and medical device companies. But Willem, as you sort of go through the maze, what is the importance here of sort of staying on top of these sort of ever-changing or ever-shifting sands?
Yeah, before I kind of touch on that particular point, Michael, I would like to just talk about the previous slide that you've got and the conduct as a key component
Sure.
of looking at your policies and controls.
Yeah.
But that the creating the right culture, it's a very common rhetoric that you hear an awful lot, but it is very true. The tone really starts from the top. If your board and your directors and don't have compliance or conduct risk within their DNA, it sets any compliance department up for a very hard task to manage compliance on a day-to-day basis. So the tone really, emanates from the top about the overall conduct of the organization. And there are ways of managing it from, of course, a documented point, but it's the pulsing of that. How do you measure the effectiveness of your conduct in line with your policies and procedures is where eventually things will have to take place, right? And that's where the board really has to take a center stage of pulsing what is the engagement, what is our overall risk in dealing with the conduct of our overall business, including the policies and procedures. And that's where it becomes very powerful, where you've got your compliance team, as a center stage to that. But just on the navigating the global legal regulatory maze, it is indeed that. It is a maze because, you've mentioned the pandemic, but there are so many other aspects, in the financial services industry. Let's take, a very common one that's regularly debated is cryptocurrency. Now, that has evolved at a rate that regulators almost can't stay on top of. I mean, cryptocurrencies you can set one up 10 a day if you wanted to. That's not like an ordinary type of currency that's pegged to your national gold, right? So it becomes very hard. And on a global scale, regulators will deal with those kinds of things on a different basis. And staying on top of that really requires some high level degree of crystal ball gazing, which is hard to do as it is. The challenge that then exists is, from that crystal ball gazing, what changes do you have to make to your overall control, your governance, your policies and procedures for the ever changing laws, because some laws may not come in for 2 years, some rapidly. That rapid amount of change that happens and the evolution, you can only do that if you've got a really, really good control system and a centralized set where people really know what is written. If you are managing it in many different portals and reviews are not happening consistently, then staying on top of the legal and regulatory landscape that faces your business on a national, even at an international level, is almost impossible. You might as well just do away with it and start again.
Yep. So we talk about managing change, and this is actually, and I hate to use the term nuts and bolts with the picture, but what do we really mean by that? And how does that, and how does sort of policy management and regulatory management fit into that, Jeff, in terms of these, management of change, principles?
Yeah, so in talking specifically about change, so policy exists, but there's some regulatory change that dictates some update to policies, which in turn requires updates to potential procedures and controls that are tied to those policies, and being able to understand the interdependencies and interrelationship between those, so that if there's a regulatory change, you know exactly where to go, not just at the policy level, but down to the paragraph level. So this policy, this regulation changed, therefore this clause in this policy needs to change, which in turn impacts this procedure and this control. And we need to update all of that immediately and then disseminate it to the organization, so we're all working to the same controls, and the most recent updated controls. So you need a solution that allows for that, right? To understand the impact of a change and how that impacts your maze of across the organization of policies, procedures, and controls, and then tracking all of that. And the other thing you mentioned earlier is disseminating it to the organization. So you need the ability to allow for your employees to understand what those changes are and very quickly know what the change is, right? If it's a 40-page policy and you've rolled out a new version that is critical with some updates, are they actually going to understand what the update was if they have to read an entire 40-page document, or can they drill down to exactly what changed in the document immediately without having to cruise through 40 pages? So all those things are critical to managing that change effectively across the organization. And I'll let Willem, jump in on that because I know he's had a lot of experience on that as well.
Yeah, and I'm gonna just to touch upon the fact that we talk about organizations, but the same goes for regulators, right? I mean, regulators are continuously changing their codes, their rules, their guidance, and they've got the same problem. I just look at the SCA handbook and the amount of pages that is, and trying to stay on top of the changes from a regulator's perspective that are facing them, from whether it's coming from law or changes to environment or lobbying activity, that becomes really quite hard even for a regulator. So if a regulator can't stay on top of it, what do organizations have a chance in many ways? But I would like to kind of talk a little bit about that, and especially kind of some of the work I did on the Tech Nation program, if I may, Michael.
Yeah, sure, definitely.
Because tracking is a very important point of that, and Jeff, you mentioned it. What aspect of the policy has changed, and is it a crucial element to really disseminate or to retest knowledge again, right? This is a very difficult one because it very much depends on the level and immaterial impact it has on the change to the policy document. But let's take it from a regulator's perspective. So I was a mentor on the Tech Nation legal tech program here in the UK, and this is semi quasi government-backed scheme, but more importantly, what you've got there is legislatives, draftsmen, you've got regulators across the industry, not just financial services, across the whole industry, including the regulatory bodies who manage lawyers and barristers here sitting on that program. And we really kind of took one piece of legislation, which pretty much everyone seems to understand, but actually not always effectively deployed. And that it was the money laundering regulations. And essentially what we kind of looked at, especially from the Tech Nation and using clause match, we imported the legislation as a whole. And what we started doing is tagging elements based on words or concepts or obligations. And very quickly, what you could start to see is a pattern where concepts fairly similar but inconsistently worded, but actually all mean the same thing. And what then happens is when you start then rolling that into your organizational documents, it can become quite confusing depending on the type of language then you use. So from a kind of tool, what we were kind of educating the legislatives, draftsmen, and overlapping other pieces of legislation on top of this, on the tagging, we kind of showing a pattern here where language was being used inconsistently, not in just one regulation, but others, and regulators' handbooks. And you're going, well, if you really want to tie this all into one piece of legislation, you have to speak the same language. Sure, some of the concepts really do need to be, broken down a little bit more, but you need to drive some level of consistency. And the RegTech solutions, especially something like a clause match, really kind of demonstrated that power to regulators. That then would allow organizations to, with new legislation coming in, you could literally upload it and tag it, and you would say, okay, how is that impacting on my policies and procedures? And that's where, especially kind of more digitized solutions, and the RegTech and the AI functionality or machine learning functionality that is ever evolving becomes an extraordinarily, powerful tool to use. Sorry, I took a little bit longer on it, but
No, that's
thought of
terrific.
drawing it out.
No. That's really, it's important for people to understand because there also was sort of a loop that you were telling us about where it actually informed ultimately the regulators and the ones who were drafting regulations about the impact of what they're doing then on the industry. And I think that's the really exciting part to bring sort of a conformity there. But I mean, the project, the work that you did is really, really interesting. Let's take a break for another question, another poll question. Okay. And then we'll get back to the program here. Our organization's compliance program is just beginning, in place, but not effective or embedded. And what I see a lot of is the third category, not to put any bias into this presentation. A mature program, but monitoring is an issue. And if anybody puts number 4 down, you are confident. You are confident. We have everything under control. So let's see where people come out on this. I'm kind of curious because I think I've seen a lot of progress in a lot of areas by people in working with them. It's with our clients and just sort of colleagues as well. Has been really interesting. Okay, let's close the poll. I'll share it, and then I got to hide it because that's what Jeff taught me. Just beginning, 8%, in place but effective, 18%. And here, this is, I'm not surprised by this at all. If anything, it makes me feel pretty confident about where we are. 54% with mature program but monitoring. And last, I love the confidence of we have everything under control. I will say this, and DOJ and everybody is sort of with the availability of technologies this day, and our next slide will talk a little bit more about that. It monitoring and sort of collecting information, real time, proactive compliance is the really hot issue right now. And that's why DOJ has been implementing or is not implementing, but promoting the idea of proactive compliance, meaning we monitor real time activities. We're not relying upon our third line of defense to audit and then find things and then do it. What they're trying to say is let's monitor more, and what they want to see is more use of technology. But that's kind of interesting, the results there. But I wanted to go this, as we're talking about technology, this is one of my favorite topics, and I'm going to turn it over to Willem again, just because we hear these terms all the time now in compliance. And I hate to say it, but real intelligence, what is real intelligence? What is the technology behind it, Willem? And how do you capture it, in a way that you can explain it also to your stakeholders within your company?
It'd be helpful if I unmuted myself.
Yeah.
But yeah, I suppose the boom of technology and recognizing the power of RegTech as a solution to manage these challenges, it becomes really quite powerful. And it comes back down to how your policies are worded and on a consistent basis. And then from there, it's kind of what I've looked at is what are the common themes that you can start tagging on, right? So building a governance of a tagging language. So whether it's a control, whether it's an obligation, whether it's a regulatory requirement, and you can start building a model on that, and then sub-tagging based on those overall criteria. As you get to that, and it comes back to data intelligence. As you start rolling those tagging processes across your policies and procedures, what you can start doing really quite neatly is harnessing the power of the tagging and create essentially a web of which policies and which statements have these particular tags, and start mapping them all together, so that if there is a particular change that happens through the tagging process, it learns from that change, and then it will tell you from the spider web, that it's been building, is this policy may actually require a change because of what you've done here, and it will give you that information real time. So this is where the power of machine learning really comes in, because the more tagging and the more data you've got from a structured point of view, the more intelligent the machine, so to speak, becomes. And that's no different in any type of artificial intelligence or machine learning. The more structured data points it has, the more the model can learn. And you can do that really quite nicely and effectively in policies and procedures as well, even though it's just words, and effectively tracking the changes and monitoring that, and essentially from there building a workflow that comes back into training and on a global basis.
It's really just a cutting edge area, and it's fascinating. And so thanks, Willem, for that sort of explanation. We talked about the concept of tying your policies to your risk assessment updates, and I kind of feel like we've sort of already sort of addressed this issue. And now we have, with the automation and technology and artificial intelligence capabilities that are pretty much available in the marketplace. So companies you need to take a look at this area and sort of government expectations, and also makes your program much more efficient. And I also like to see in policies and procedures a reflection of your resource allocation. I will say this, Jeff, there's a really interesting question, and I know we probably, whether or not we'll get to all the questions today, but it came in as we were talking, and I wanted to sort of discuss it with you, which is, are we suggesting, or what's our reaction to having global policies in a global company, and then having policies that vary for local jurisdictions? And I will tell you, sort of just my own bias in this area is, certain policies are important enough that we will set standards that cut across the entire global operation. So, for example, anti-corruption policies tend to be global in nature because we set a standard that's going to meet whatever requirements are out there. Let's say the UK Bribery Act is the most stringent, or the Brazil Clean Companies Act. We're going to use that global policy, because once you start injecting local variations, it gets more difficult to manage. On the other hand, I've seen situations where, let's take anti-kickback laws or whatever within the United States. There's certain rules and regulations that apply in certain states that are more stringent than in other states. There's state regulation, which gets into that. And I've seen policies that are, let's say, within the United States, but then they'll have sections that mention, let's say, Vermont, which happens to have a very tough type of program in that. But Jeff, how does a technology tool allow you to sort of manage that process in terms of global and what's local, and how can you stay on top of that?
Well, I mean, the technology can certainly help, right? Like I talked about earlier with the master policy and then localized versions of it. But what you were just talking about more is a decision tied back to the culture, right? So if you truly are living the culture of what it says in your code of conduct and what your company believes, you're going to have to make a decision. Are we going to vary from that cultural norm in a certain geography just because we can? And that you mentioned, even in the U.S., state by state legislation around data privacy and things with California, and even what goes back to training on sexual harassment. There's different regulations in different states, and some companies take the approach that we're gonna, because of our culture, we're gonna take the most stringent requirement and apply it across the United States or across the globe, where others want to do the bare minimum that they can, and that reflects in their culture. And you'll see the ultimate results of that based on how other or people and individuals perceive your organization, and do they believe you're living into your culture?
And just to add on to that, and being the real practitioner and having to manage global teams, you're absolutely right, Michael. Anti-bribery corruption, legislation, that is a really good one, but it's consistent across, other things, right? For example, KYC and
Right.
financial crime or counter-terrorist financing, all those kinds of things. And again, emanating from your culture, there is some degree of commonality in most of these standards. If you want to really operate at the highest degree, you look at some of the commonality through your risk assessments. What are the differences? What are the differences from a local perspective? And then you start looking at it from an overall snapshot. Where can we actually get the bar to align across every organization? And you have your framework. That's your framework. But naturally, there are going to be certain practices that you will have to localize. I'll take an absolute crucial one. Coming back to KYC, the custom due diligence programs that you see in the US, you have to capture tax ID and SSN. Well, we don't have the concept of SSN in the UK, so we can't prescribe for that on a global basis. But what you can then start doing is you can start tailoring, matrices that have some local aspects, but overall tie in quite nicely into the global framework. And that's the power of what you have, these digital solutions, because you can start properly documenting these out that then go into a control framework.
That's a great point in terms of, even that simple example and how you can use the digital management system. Just a quick point from the DOJ, just to come back to the functions that are going to be updating in your continuous sort of loop of monitoring and gaining more information and data are your risk assessments, and we've talked about that, your policies and procedures, and your financial and compliance controls. And again, we say risk assess. This is just, and again, I know people have had some trouble downloading the slides. I just want to reassure everybody, you'll get more than enough copies of the slides, and you can use them as book stands as well. But here are sort of some of the real-time monitoring and continuous improvement. And again, that's captured in your culture and captured in your policies and procedures that Jeff and Willem have really sort of talked about. We also want to make sure that we're documenting our process. And this, I think, we tried to make Jeff made a point earlier with Willem about this but trust me that the Justice Department and regulators, and I think even more so in the UK and in the EU, there's a feeling of you better be able to show us. We're not going to take your word that you did something. We need to see the documentation. And I've been, unfortunately, in a situation where we didn't have that documentation representing a client, and they're just not going to credit it based upon the word that you're going to provide them. So this is why. Yeah, go ahead.
As a matter of fact, there is a common joke in the financial services industry here in the UK, because the regulator requires us to abide by at least 11 core principles for business, which talks about integrity, treating customers fairly, being open and honest with your regulator, all that kind of stuff. But there is one principle that they've never, written, which is a very, very interesting one, because it's not written, is what is not written down doesn't exist in the regulator's mind.
Exactly.
And that's what we would call principle 12, which actually is not written down. That's a common joke.
Yeah. But also, it's like, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. That's what we hear from DOJ. So these are important principles. Remember, you can have the best operating system you think you could put together, but if we're not documenting it, it's not going to get us as far as we want. Um, the other point about the digital sort of approach or taking a holistic approach is how we can facilitate cooperation and reporting amongst the various components within our company. And we want to make sure that we're doing that as well and across these critical functions. I wanted to just give a moment here for Jeff, if you could, Jeff, and I know this is, and then if we have a little bit of time, we'll try to get to some of the questions. But if we don't reach any of your questions, please, we will respond to them in writing. We'll circle back to you. And and we will get the slides out as Amanda promised earlier today. But Jeff, just a few, if you could hit some of the themes from that sort of tie into clause match.
Yeah, sure. Well, based on, I want to respect everybody's time. We only have a couple minutes left. So I think the problems we're solving are all the things we talked about today, right? The manual effort in managing all of this and evidencing it to either internally or externally, whether it's to executive management board or regulators or auditors. Not only are we doing it right, but we're able to evidence that we're doing it right. We talked about this concept of mapping and understanding the impact of regulatory change across the organization, and how do we understand what that regulatory change and the impact of that has across the organization, whether it be locally or globally. And then, one of the things you said at the very beginning, Michael, is right, get business buy-in to the policies and procedures as well. So how do we collaborate in a formal fashion and an automated fashion to get everybody's input so that there's buy-in across the organization to the policies and procedures you put in place? So those are the real challenges that we're trying to solve for. And then, why we see current solutions not working? Well, it continually astounds me how I walk in to major corporations that would be one of the ones that say we have everything under control and we don't need any help. And then they try to implement our solution. And one of the first things we do is before we put garbage into the solution is we wanted to go through a policy rationalization, right? So we ask them to gather all of their policies together and let's just make sure that what we're loading in is the most recent version. And ultimately, it's an overwhelming ask. They don't even know where their policies are, what they are. We had one organization that had thousands and thousands of policies. We went through that policy rationalization process and eliminated over 50% of those policies as being either outdated, redundant, or for whatever other reason. And that was an organization that was one of those that felt that they really had it buttoned up. So we see that regularly. And current solutions just don't allow for that to be managed properly. Our solution really, there's two components to it: the policy management, lifecycle management solution, and the regulatory change management solution. We'll be glad to go into more detail with anybody on all of that. But based on time, we'll leave that for a more in-person demonstration. But we're bringing huge value, right? And this is what it really comes down to. We had a note the other day from a very large global organization that said, since using clause match, it's the first time in their history they were able to document that 100% of their policies were reviewed and updated on time. And they've never even come close to that before. They never even exceeded 50%. And that's part of the automation that we bring to the table. Reducing time, oversight, improving oversight, reducing cost, and ability to prove compliance to the regulators, all as big results of using our platform.
And let me run just one last poll here, just so that if anybody's interested in sort of hearing more about the clause match policy management solution, please let us know. And there's a lot of things that we think that are, and I can tell you, Willem says he's worked with it. I've seen the program, and it's really, Jeff is pretty modest. It's pretty amazing, and there are a lot of things that it can do to really elevate your program. So please let us know. if you're interested in that. But Jeff, we will, and I apologize again about sort of going through this with the questions, and we will definitely write and get get back to you on this. Thank you everybody for attending. I want to say, Willem, it's been a pleasure. It's my first time actually doing a webinar with Willem, and it's been just an absolute pleasure. And Jeff, as always, it's great to work with you. You do great work with people, and it's just a pleasure to work with you. And thank you again to Amanda Brief for setting this up, and for Clause Match. And so again, we'll get you the slides, and the recording will be available as well on Friday if you want other people to hear about it at your company. But we really appreciate it, and thank you everybody again.
Thank you, Michael, for your kind words.
Yeah, and thank you, Willem. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.